But like it or not, Jesus is better attested to as a historical figure than most figures throughout history. He didn't write down anything himself because I think for good reasons that he was illiterate, but it did not take long for people to start writing about him.
Well, the minimal mythicist position doesn't require Jesus to have written anything, which I know that that's not what Captain Dadpool is saying that we are expecting. Dadpool just seems to be explaining the situation. But the minimal mythicist position does only deal with the evidence that we actually have, not the evidence that we don't have. And since Jesus didn't write anything, we don't consider that to be evidence. But saying that Jesus is better attested than most historical figures at that time is just wrong. Consider the evidence that we do have for a historical Jesus. We really only have the writings of Paul as our earliest known source about Jesus, and he isn't even an eyewitness of Jesus. Paul seems to only attest to a celestial version of Christ when he talks about his visions from Jesus, as well as other ways in which he got his information, namely through the scriptures. Paul even directly states that he did not get his information from any human sources. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preached is not of human origin. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it. Rather, I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. Galatians 1:11 through 12. A popular historical figure to compare to Jesus Christ is Alexander the Great, and that's because his best biography was written by Arian some 400 years after Alexander the Great's death. So, just like Paul wasn't an eyewitness to Jesus being on earth, Arian also was not an eyewitness to Alexander the Great. But do you know what Alexander has that Jesus definitely doesn't? Eyewitnesses to Alexander existing. Arian had access to accounts from 2 of Alexander the Great's generals. We know this because Arian has an extensive section on the sources that he used and why he considered them to be the best sources. He also discusses how he resolves contradictions in his sources. Can you honestly name another person in history that we consider to be historical for which we only have mad visions of his heavenly form to appeal to? The only saving grace for Paul is the fact that he has a lot of vague verses in his epistles that could be interpreted as mentioning a historical Jesus. But they could also work with the idea that Paul only ever considered Jesus to be celestial. Now, we will be covering a couple of Paul's verses today, but that shouldn't detract from the argument that Jesus is better attested than most historical figures. Keep in mind, though, that comparable historical figures have actual eyewitness accounts that can be used to verify that they indeed existed. And if not eyewitness accounts, then we can appeal to physical evidence, or evidence from events in history that could have only happened due to that person existing. These are a far cry from just visions of a celestial person.
Our earliest source? Paul. Yes, he's biased, but that doesn't mean you automatically throw it out as being 100% unreliable. If we did that with American history, we would know nothing about American history. If you have a source that's biased, what that means is you scrutinize it a little heavier.
I emphatically agree with Captain Dadpool on this point. So it's a good thing that mythicism doesn't throw out Paul as 100% unreliable, and we deeply scrutinize Paul as a historical source. What does it mean to deeply scrutinize a historical source, though? I would think that you would want to analyze what Paul said and how he said it. I would think that you would also want to know what were the common Jewish theologies that were going around, and then compare those theologies to the things that Paul is saying in his epistles. As we know, the way that people talk changed depending on time period, location, and culture. It's also important to know what people of not only Judaism, but also the surrounding religious landscape believed about their reality. Now that would be some deep scrutiny right there.